Okay, so this part of Chapter 3 focuses on adolescent intelligence and how it is. All right, so we're going to start first with what's called a psychometric view of intelligence. And this particular view states that we can measure intelligence by using IQ tests. One of the widely used ones is called the STANFORD-BINET, and then we'll also talk about the Wechsler scales. And based on these particular tests, the idea is that we can come up with an intelligence quotient, which is a number that is supposed to indicate intelligence that is made up of the person's mental age divided by chronological age. So mental age is basically the individual's level of mental development in comparison to others, and then chronological age is how old you are in terms of calendar years. So Alfred Binet was the first person to come up with this, and he was originally commissioned by the French government to develop some kind of test to identify school children who were slow learners. So children who would need extra help in the classroom so that those things could be provided for them. So then based on how children performed on Binet's IQ test, he classified them according to the normal distribution, and that's what you see represented down here. So this normal distribution basically states that 100 is the average or the mean IQ score in the population. So most people will fall within 1 standard deviation below and 1 standard deviation above the mean. So most people will fall in terms of the Stanford-Binet IQ score between 84 and 116 in terms of the average IQ in the population. The farther out that we move from this mean of 100, either above or below, the less likely it is that we will find people in the population who have that particular IQ score. So 100 is the most common, and most people will fall between 84 and 116. So this is an example here of items that you might see on what are called the Wechsler scales of intelligence. So it's W, E, C, H, S, L, E, R. Not as easy as it looks to type those things out. So on these Wechsler scales of intelligence, so this is the most widely used measure of intelligence testing worldwide. And so you guys see there are lots and lots of examples here. So some things up here that look at verbal knowledge, so comprehension, we might ask similarities here. There's a nonverbal block design where I show you a picture of a particular design, and then you have blocks like the ones that you see here where the person is timed and has to put the blocks together to match this design. This one up here is called figure weights. So for this one I show you an example as you see here, and then you have to choose, kind of based on logic and reasoning, what fills in the puzzle on item number 2. And then for this one is a cancellation type test where you have to go through the items here as quickly as possible and find every red square and every yellow triangle. So we're looking basically at how fast are you, how well can you pay attention, how can you ignore distractions. All right, so where are intelligence tests used? So intelligence tests are tools, right? They are just tools that are oftentimes used in educational settings to help with diagnosis of things like learning disorders, but also used to help children gain admission to gifted and talented programs. However, this is just kind of one part of the puzzle. So this is just one way to think about intelligence. And oftentimes these intelligence tests are pretty staunchly criticized for thinking of intelligence very narrowly. So essentially this psychometric view of intelligence really does equate the kinds of skills that make you a good student, so think academic kinds of skills, with intelligence. Well, as you'll see as we go through some other theories, that is just one way to think about intelligence. It's certainly not the only way to think about intelligence. All right, so let's move into some competing theories of intelligence. So moving away from the psychometric approach, which again is typically viewed as pretty narrow, focusing only on academic skills, in Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, there are 3 types of intelligence. So the first one here is called this analytical. This one is most closely related to what the psychometric view emphasizes for intelligence. So this is the ability to analyze, to judge, to evaluate, to compare, and contrast. Creative intelligence is the ability to create, design, invent, originate, and imagine. And then practical intelligence is seen in people who can use, apply, implement, and put ideas into practice. So for Sternberg then, he basically says that for students who fall into the creative or the practical tract, sometimes they have a really difficult time in school because oftentimes classes only support the analytical type of approach. But clearly analytical is just one way to think about intelligence. Another theory of intelligence, and this one is really popular in education, this is Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So Gardner then suggests there are 8 different types of intelligence. He also refers to them as frames of mind. So if you look at the types of intelligence here, we have the verbal linguistic. So this is people who are good writers, maybe good public speakers. The logical mathematical, so people who are good at analyzing problems, people who are good at using numbers. Naturalistic, so people who are strongly connected to the natural environment. So think like a farmer or a botanist would be good careers for these people. Intrapersonal, so intra means to look within, so people who know themselves very well. Visual spatial, so people who are good at seeing things in visual format. So an architect, or if you're good at geometry, that would be examples of the visual spatial. Musical, obviously related to music, right? So singing, musical instrument expertise. Bodily kinesthetic, people who kind of know how to use their bodies effectively. So think people who are athletes, people who are dancers. And then interpersonal, so inter means between. So people who are perhaps good at getting along well with other people, establish empathy and rapport easily. So someone who is an effective counselor would be an example of the interpersonal intelligence. And then our final theory here of a competing definition of intelligence focuses on what's called emotional intelligence. So with emotional intelligence, there is basically emphasis on interpersonal and intrapersonal, and then also practical aspects of intelligence. So this particular approach popularized by Daniel Goleman, but it was originally developed by Peter Salovey and John Mayer in 1990. And so in this particular approach, we're looking at people who are able to both perceive emotions in other people, but also to express their own emotions, both accurately and also in a way that kind of makes sense given the context. They understand their emotions, emotion knowledge. They use their feelings to be able to facilitate thinking, and then also being able to control your emotions. So someone who has a high degree of emotional intelligence is able to understand, for example, when he or she becomes angry or frustrated, and then also able to control those emotions and potentially channel them into a more appropriate path. So one of the ongoing issues in the study of intelligence criticizes some of these theories of multiple intelligences that we've talked about here. So this is basically criticizing Sternberg's approach and criticizing Gardner's approaches here. So these theories contributed to the field in the sense that They allow us to think a lot more broadly about where people's intelligence may lie, what their competencies are, and they've also been applied a lot in the realm of education. So educators then can develop programs that instruct students in different domains. However, there is considerable criticism here that there's just not enough research that actually supports that there are different types of intelligence. Many psychologists rely on this concept of what we will call G, which is a general intelligence. So this idea of G, the general intelligence, essentially states that we have a foundational level of intelligence, that's the general intelligence, and from that foundational base or foundational level of general intelligence, specific abilities flow. And so outlining these abilities that people have in these multiple intelligences, it might make more sense to think about those as abilities, but to still talk about this G or underlying level of general intelligence. So in terms of heredity and the environment, this is one of those nature-nurture issues that is so important in developmental psychology. In the sense of trying to determine essentially how much of intelligence is due to genetics and how much of that is due to the quality of the environment. So heredity then, research studies reveal that there is a very strong influence of genetics on intelligence. If you look at the graph that is outlined for you here, you see identical twins versus fraternal twins. So identical twins, we know, share 100% of their genetic material, whereas fraternal twins only share about 50% of their genetic material. So the similarities here then show that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins in terms of their level of intelligence, which gives us some pretty strong evidence that heredity makes a really big difference. However, we also know that there is a role for the environment here. So people who are growing up in impoverished environments that lack stimulation are going to have their level of intelligence impacted by that. And people who are growing up in environments that are more stimulating, that are richer, in terms of content, are going to have their intelligence levels positively affected by that. So there is this constant interplay between these two factors. All right, and then talking about our last concept here called social cognition. So social cognition is basically the way that we think about and reason about our social world. So cognition, right, is all about the science of thinking, and so the thinking here then is applied to our social world. So we're going to talk a little bit about how adolescents think about their social world, which includes the people that they interact with, the relationships that they have, the groups that they participate in, etc. So a couple of the biggest concepts that you will see here related specifically to adolescence, this construct of what's called adolescent egocentrism. So if you're egocentric, it means that you're very focused on yourself. And so for adolescents, they are like hyper focused on themselves. So they have this kind of heightened sense of self-consciousness. They believe that everyone is as fascinated by them and as interested in them as they are in themselves. And they also believe that they are personally unique, so no one else is like them, no one else could ever understand what they're going through, and they're also invincible, so nothing bad is ever going to happen to them. So David Elkind then in the 1970s came up with some specific concepts to describe this. So the first is what he calls an imaginary audience. So in the imaginary audience, the basic idea is that adolescents believe that other people are hyper-focused on them, other people are watching them all the time. So it's almost like they're on stage, right? And other people are watching their performance. We also know then about the personal fable that David Elkind outlines here too. So the personal fable is basically that no one can possibly ever understand me. I'm so unique, and also that I am never going to die. So no matter what I do, I'm still going to continue living. So that's that illusion of invincibility. So more recent research here argues that the distortions in adolescent thinking related to this imaginary audience and the personal fable actually involve changes in the adolescent's ego and also changes in perspective taking. And those kinds of things are very heavily tied to cognitive development and also brain development as well. We now know also that in a longitudinal study of adolescents between the ages of 11 to 21, adolescent egocentrism is still very prominent in 18 to 21-year-olds. So this isn't something that just kind of goes away, magically at the end of adolescence. It seems like it actually continues into emerging adulthood.